It's Tuesday, July 15th, 2025, and we have a pretty decent risk of severe weather centered on the northern plains and northern parts of the Midwest, with two slight risk of severe weather. One out here is going to be centered on central Nevada, and then the other one is going to be centered up here in parts of eastern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the Michigan Peninsula. Then this is going to be surrounded by a marginal risk of severe weather. Then we have two other isolated marginal risk of severe weather. One is going to be out here stretching from Nevada back into Utah. Then we have another one in the southeastern corner of Arizona. Other places where I do think we could see a marginal introduced would be pretty much anywhere along the east coast, stretching all the way up from Florida into Maryland, and then along a stationary boundary which goes all the way through the Mississippi River Valley and all the way up into the Mid-Atlantic, which will also have a vorticity maximum from a shortwave tracking through it. Today's risk is mostly going to be fueled by a wind threat. We have two 15% chances of some damaging winds out here. One is going to be in our Nevada risk area, and our other one in our eastern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin risk area. In both of these areas, gusts in excess of 60 miles an hour could be possible. Then in all of our 5% areas, damaging gusts eclipsing 60 miles an hour could also be a possibility as well. And our hail risk is going to be centered back on our Nevada risk area and even stretches up into the southeastern corner of South Dakota. Then we have a pretty decently sized 5% conditional risk of some hail. In our 50% chance area, we could even see hail above 1.5 inches in diameter today. But in our 5% risk area, we could see hail possibly at around 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And then we have two isolated small chances of tornadoes. One is going to be out here in our Nebraska risk area. Then our other one is going to be up here in our northern Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota risk area. And these are going to be highlighting the small probability of possibly a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes in both of these risk areas. Today, it looks like we're going to have widespread flooding potential across much of the U.S. Our main area to focus on is going to be our northern plains and northern Midwest risk area. Then out here on the eastern coast, we do have two isolated areas. One is going to be in the southeastern corner of Arizona. Then our other one is going to be in central Texas. Yet again, the central Texas one is going to be associated with rainfall from early this morning and could be anywhere from around 2 to 5 inches. And our other risk out here in southeastern Arizona is going to be pretty conditional. The models aren't really showing anywhere getting more than 3 inches, but that risk could be increased by the terrain out here. And then in our Florida risk area, we could see anywhere between 2 to 5 inches rain, and that would be centered on central Florida. And then back up here in the Mid-Atlantic, the same thing would go for this area. Then for all of our marginal risk areas, that's just for that conditional threat of 1 to 2 inches of rain up there. And then lastly, in our northern plains risk area, this tongue stretching from the northeastern corner of Nebraska all the way up to the Michigan Peninsula would hold that same threat for possibly 2 to 4 inches of rain. And here's a more visual look at our precipitation down here in Florida. We're going to see as that tropical system moves across the state, it's going to be widespread 1 to 2 inches of rain with a lot of isolated areas between 3 to 5 inches of rain, especially up here just a bit north of central Florida. Then in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's going to be pretty much the same story as down here in Florida, where there's going to be widespread 1 to 2 inches of rain with some isolated areas between 2 to 4. And then back up here in the northern plains is where I think we could see a pretty decent flood risk with, once again, widespread areas of 1 to 2 inches, but a quite a bit larger and not as isolated area, possibly receiving upwards of 2 inches of rain and would fall anywhere between that 2 to 4 inches rain. And in central Texas and our San Antonio risk area, this morning, we could see potentially a corridor receiving anywhere between 2 to 5 inches of rain. And our temperatures across our country are going to be pretty much the same, either at or above average for what is normal, except we're going to see a bit of an anomaly up here in the northern plains. As a trough pushes in, we're going to see some extremely below average temperatures, possibly even in the high 50s, which is kind of unheard of at this time of year. So definitely some happy people up there in the northern plains. But in the rest of the country, it's either going to be normal or above average. A couple areas which could see some really hot temperatures are going to be down here in the southeast with an associated high pressure system, which could possibly be in the high 90s. And then up here in the central plains could also be anywhere between the low to mid 90s. And then out west is going to continue to see those above average temperatures as well. Here's our simulated reflectivity from our central to northern plains risk area, and we can see that around the early to mid-afternoon, we're going to start to get storm initiation. In this earlier state of these storms, they would pose more of a hail threat, but as they congeal more into that line, they would bring more of a severe wind threat. And something to note is that these storms would be probably higher based, so they'll mostly just be a strong damaging wind threat, possibly in excess of 60 to 70 miles an hour. But also, as this storm starts to move into areas where cloud tops have covered in front of them and that low level jet kicks in, there also could be a conditional spin-up tornado risk, and this line would continue pretty long into the night hours today, with it continuing to bring that threat of some damaging winds. Another cluster is going to be back up here in eastern Wyoming, which could be expected to push into parts of western Nebraska and western South Dakota. And the main threat with this storm would be some hail and damaging winds as well. However, because this storm is going to be behind that pretty strong cold front, I do have questions about how intense these storms can get, but nonetheless, there is definitely that conditional risk for some strong damaging winds and some large hail. With this line, although because it would be linear, it would mostly just be a damaging wind threat, and that would also push pretty late into the night today, all the way into Wednesday morning. And our last main cluster of storms would be all the way out here from central Minnesota all the way out into Wisconsin and the Michigan Peninsula, and these storms would possibly start to get organized and bring that severe threat around midday today. And the threat with these storms would mostly be damaging winds with a conditional threat, possibly a spin-up tornado or two along this line, and then even some small hail. And then these would push through, and this line would actually not last as long as our other lines back in the Central Plains. It would probably die off a little after nightfall. And then from our marginal risk up here in Nevada, which stretches back into Utah, and then another risk down here in the southeastern corner of Arizona, I do think the risk for these areas is going to be pretty conditional because the lack of loads of moisture and Cape out here, but because there is going to be a high pressure system centered on the southwest, bringing some storm organizing shear, some favorable troughing up here, which is also going to help our Nevada and Utah storms, and even the possibility of an MCS forming down here in the southeastern corner of Arizona, coupled with quite a bit of downdraft Cape. I do think that conditional risk would be there for possibly some damaging winds in excess of 60 miles an hour. And I think another corridor to watch would be up here along a stationary boundary and a vorticity maximum from a shortwave, which is going to move up into the northeast back here in the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. So possibly some strong clusters of storms back there, bringing that damaging wind threat. Then, of course, our afternoon storms out here in the mid-Atlantic. These have a lower chance of becoming severe today, but I definitely wouldn't rule out a strong cluster of storms, possibly bringing that damaging wind risk to the region. And the last area to look at is going to be a Florida risk area, as that system that's tropical in nature sort of traverses the state. I definitely do think there would be the possibility of a couple of strong to severe clusters because of the high amounts of moisture and Cape out here. Now here are our 500 millibar winds, and we're actually going to see a slew of short waves which are expected to help bring some severe weather to the U.S. today. One is going to be a short wave passing through our Minnesota and Wisconsin risk area, and we're going to see a couple of short waves passing through an area with enhanced flow, which was actually going to be squeezed by that high pressure system up here in Nevada and Utah. And we see yet another short wave, which is going to move through our Nevada risk area. So generally a lot of troughing back here, which could help to bring some storms. And we're going to want to watch a corridor which stretches from the northeastern corner of Texas all the way up into the Ohio River Valley, with a vorticity maximum or short wave which moves through the region, which could possibly bring a couple of severe storms. And there would also be a high pressure system back here in the southeast, which could possibly bring some organizing shear to those. Now here's a weather sounding with our Nebraska cluster storms, and we do see some curvature in our low level of our hodograph and a bit of a elongation, which is one of the reasons for that spin up tornado risk. Our shear isn't going to be super great, and our organizing shear isn't even going to be that super duper either. But we do see some decent wind veering, which could help to organize those storms. We have quite a bit of Cape up near our freezing level. Then our mid-level lapse rates are going to be quite high at 8.3 Celsius, decreasing per kilometer. Now, the only thing that would hinder this is a quite high freezing level, but all of our other ingredients, except for the lack of a lot of organizing shear, point at possibly some large hail around 1.5 inches in diameter. We have a very moist for the region, and then a very unstable for the region as well environment nearing 5,000 joules per kilogram, and then a dew point of 70. So definitely very favorable for some strong severe storms. Our downdraft Cape is going to be super high at around 1800, so possibly some winds exceeding 70 miles an hour. And our 3 Cape, which normally is pretty low for this region, isn't even going to be that poor, which is another reason for that just general threat and some strong severe weather, and possibly even a spin-up tornado threat along that line. Now, what would hinder that spin-up tornado threat is going to be some high cloud bases. But as the storms push southeast into areas that have already been covered by clouds in front of the storms, these could be lowered, and that spin-up tornado threat could possibly become heightened as that low-level jet kicks in around the evening hours. And here's a look from our Minnesota and Wisconsin risk area. We do see a very decent curve in the low levels of our hodograph. Our shear and our helicity are going to be very conducive for possibly a couple of spin-up tornadoes, possibly even a couple of strong spin-up tornadoes. And our organizing shear isn't going to be too bad either at around 30 knots. Now, we don't really have much veering in our winds, if any, so that would lower that tornado threat perhaps and the threat of some organized storms up here. We do have a decent bit of cape up here near our freezing level, and our mid-level lapse rates are going to be at 7 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. So definitely some hail, possibly at around 3/4 to an inch in diameter. Our lowest cloud level would be low enough to possibly support that threat of some spin up tornadoes. We also have a very moist environment and then also a very unstable environment at around 3,000 joules per kilogram. So definitely favorable for severe storms. Our 3 cape is also going to be very high as well at 165, which could help to increase that spin up tornado threat and that threat of some severe winds. And our precipitable water is going to be 1.78, which could possibly increase the strength of those downdrafts. So up here in our central to northern plains, all the way up into our northern Midwest risk areas, I definitely do think we could see all hazards of severe weather, but mostly a linear storm mode. Now, something we can't forget is the decently high chance of some formation of something tropical in the Gulf this week. And the Storm Prediction Center has actually upgraded it for the 3rd day in a row to a 40% chance of formation. And here is it in its current state right off the eastern coast of Florida. And we can definitely see some spinach, but something we do note is that there's not a lot of convection going on in the center of the storm, which doesn't really indicate any rapid organizing. So definitely this storm won't really become organized at all as it traverses Florida, but the chance of it becoming organized as it goes through the Gulf and moves possibly up into the Gulf states is definitely still there. Now, in the short term, we already mentioned the flooding threat that it could bring to Florida, but in the long term, these are European ensembles, and we're seeing quite a bit of stuff hinting at development out here, and we're actually seeing a pretty crazy amount of agreement of this storm pushing into the Mississippi River Delta, and the intensities on these are varying quite a bit, anywhere from tropical depression all the way up to a weak Category 1 hurricane. But the one thing that's consistent is the high agreement on some development happening out here, and actually a pretty high agreement on where it will go. But this is still going to be about 3 days out, with a possible landfall at the earliest being on Friday. So I expect that this would probably move maybe some more as we get closer to that date. And another big thing for this system will be how it interacts with the Florida Peninsula, and we'll see if it will have that chance of re-strengthening into something big or maybe something not so big. Now, something that is for certain is that the sea surface temperatures out here where this storm is going to be traversing are going to be absolutely scalding. They're going to be extremely high and extremely conducive for some tropical development. And the ocean heat content in the same area, which feels like it gets better day by day, is also going to be quite a bit. So definitely the ocean would be primed for development of something tropical. And another thing is that where this storm is going to be developing, there's going to be an area of some muted shear. Now, there is going to be some wind shear, which wouldn't really be conducive to the formation of this storm. But as we move forward into Friday, we can see that where this storm is going to be right about here is actually an area of some muted shear, which would be more conducive for this storm to form. And then we can actually see what's steering our storm is going to be a high pressure system that's bringing a lot of that heat to the southeast, but it could actually play a very large role into steering the storm. If this storm could possibly latch onto it, which it appears is likely, it could follow a track, possibly even into the Mississippi River Delta. And here's a look at the moisture for the storm. The area with the greatest moisture in the Gulf is going to be where our storm is going to be, and we can see that it will be battling some dry air in its center right after it traverses the Florida Peninsula, which could possibly spell bad news for the organization of this storm. But it looks like it will likely be done with that dry air as it makes its final push towards a potential landfall. So I would say that the moisture for this storm is also going to be fairly conducive as well. So in summary, I definitely think the environment isn't superb, but I do think it's fairly okay and would be supportive for some development out in the Gulf, or anywhere between a tropical depression all the way up to a weak hurricane.